pioneer brand canola with Optimum Gly, the highest yielding glyphosate-tolerant trait on the market. What's next in canola happens here.
Thank you to our show sponsors, RealAg Shops, the Successors, and Nutrien eKonomics. From nutrient management to the latest weather, market, and ag trends, The Dirt, an eKonomics podcast, is your place for farm smart topics to boost profitability. Join Mike Howell on Season 3 of The Dirt podcast, available now at nutrien-economics.com. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Agronomists. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, and the news is coming fast and furious today. So just, Pete Rose died, everybody. Sorry about breaking the news, just getting texts. But also, as we were discussing just before we went live, so did John, the actor who played John on Days of Our Lives. So depending on which how you spent your youth, one of those is probably pretty important to you. Okay, welcome here after I digress on pop culture and sports. We are going to talk about fall cereals, and I am super excited to do so. But before I bring in my guests, a reminder, of course, if you collect those CEU credits, head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists. Go there tomorrow. Let us know you took in the show. We'll get you those CEU credits. To have this conversation, we're going to talk, yes, winter wheat, but don't worry, there's more. We're going to talk cereal rye, maybe some winter barley, maybe even some winter triticale, and maybe even some ultra early seeding and frost seeding. The world is our oyster. Let's bring in our guests to have this conversation. We've got Joanna Follings with OMAFA, is the way I pronounce it, which is of course not accurate, but our Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Agribusiness, and Brian Beres with AAFC out of Lethbridge. Welcome here, both of you.
Thank you.
All right. Joanna, are you saying OMAFA yet? Because we're really trying to make it happen. No?
I don't want to get in trouble, but I'm still saying OMAFRA.
Joanna, you are going to be in trouble. Okay. All right. Okay. So here we are, last day of September. Pretty exciting to see what's all happening finally on the landscape here. But Brian, maybe I'll start with you. Lethbridge makes me think super dry, very windy, but you guys did actually get some moisture at some point this year. So how did it all turn out?
Well, yeah, it's going to be one of those years where it might even look normal, when you look back on it and you just look at the amount received, but the timing of it was terrible. And it's just been a bit crazy. I went outside to start the barbecue last night and there was pea-sized hail raining down on me. That's the kind of year it's been in Lethbridge and elsewhere, obviously.
Yeah. Now we are going to talk about several trials that you've done. What was the coolest trial you did this year?
Gee, you're putting me on the spot here. I still think the stuff that we're doing with the ultra early wheat probably,
it's still pretty cool.
Even career-wise kind of tops things out or is up there anyway.
Yep. Okay. Joanna, this is, I would imagine, a very busy time for you. What with, and we do see in the comments, we've got certainly some azuki beans coming off. Yeah. Soybeans have started in a lot of areas. How are things shaping up for getting this winter wheat crop in the ground here in Ontario?
Yeah, so things have actually been moving along quite nicely. Lots of, as you said, azukis, soys coming off. Even those that utilize cereals with corn silage are being able to get the corn silage off cereals. And after that, things were a little bit questionable the last couple of weeks just with how dry it had been. And there was a lot of questions and concerns about moisture, some challenges with getting drills into the ground, getting those drills deep enough. But very fortunately, we got some rain last week, and I think that was very well received across the province. And even those cereals that were already emerged, they really needed that drink. So I think things are shaping up to be a really good year, to be honest. And hopefully things keep progressing that way, but it's starting to cool off now a little bit.
Yeah, it was, and I mean, I like to complain about heat, so I will. September was
we all.
Yeah, well, September was very warm and the driest month we had from June. Now, Brian,
Yeah.
we'll keep this, of course, in line with what dry really means. I'm not going to pretend for a moment that it was Lethbridge dry, but for Ontario, it did actually get quite dried out. Like, yeah.
Yeah, no, it was like lots of growers were asking questions about trying different things, whether they should consider tillage in scenarios where they're no-till, typically just to see if they could do something with that. But I see in the chat there, some are saying even though wheat seeded already last night has germinated, and I think getting that moisture last week came a long way. And we were probably going to have to knock on the door of our Western partners out there to kind of learn a few things from them in terms of dry seeding, because you guys experience that way more than we typically do in Ontario.
Way more. Yes.
Way more.
Way more. So let's maybe set that, and that's actually a great place to start. So of course we're talking winter cereals or fall seeded cereals. So that we're not just talking wheat. It probably will be most of what we'll talk about. But Brian, it is a question that we get often, and even Manitoba at times can be dry in the fall, and we get the question of, do you chase moisture? And let's say you're in the window of a good window, you're not late, you're not super early. Do you chase moisture, or do you go shallow and you're pretty sure it's going to rain? What's the answer in the Lethbridge area?
Well, I mean, I think it extends beyond Lethbridge, but it all boils down to, do you have the conditions to get good seed to soil contact, and aside from moisture. So if you're going to try and go in with a knife opener when your ground is like a sidewalk, that's just a recipe for disaster. This year's a great example where it really paid to wait, because the moisture usually comes, and then I don't know if we'll have time to show some of those slides around planting dates or not, but it's not the end of the world if you wait it out a bit. And we even have growers in Saskatchewan that are like, you know what, by the time I'm done planting, everything's like a sidewalk. I'm waiting, and if I even have to put it in dormant, I'm going to. And we know not everybody has a disc drill, which really facilitates really good and significantly higher winter wheat yields, but not everybody does have a disc drill. So if you're a knife opener guy or girl, that complicates things in the context of dry, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so hang on for a second. Let's be clear on our terminology. What's dormant seeding?
Well, so dormant seeding would be a condition where you planted and there was no opportunity for it to actually sprout and take off and emerge. So you're basically kind of putting it in a casket for a while, and you're going to resurrect it later on and hope things turn out for the good. And they typically do. We can talk about how that compares to other practices later, I guess.
Sure. So, and Joanna, that is something that we do see in Ontario. We're not typically, aiming to be dormant seeding, but if we put seed in the ground very late, let's say, and we don't actually see any green, but it can still make a crop, right? Like, so long as it just germinates, then vernalizes, it still can. So,
yes.
So walk me through that process.
Yes, we absolutely can. But at the end of the day, we aren't going to see the same yield potential as we would like to see earlier in the season. So we're not going to be able to optimize or maximize our head per meter square or our biomass. So if you're really someone looking to break up the rotation and get that cereal in, you can absolutely do that and be successful, but have the caveat that you might not have as much yield potential as what you'd like to see. If an earlier seeded crop, and it's also going to be dependent on what kind of weather we get through the winter months as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, we are going to talk a bit about a few different options of what we can put in. One of the things that also comes up, though, and Mark actually has brought it up here, broadcast wheat is 3.5 to 4 inches tall today and firing up the drill next week. So broadcasting wheat or other crops, and we did here at our farm, we broadcast on cereal rye into standing beans. There's a few things to think about with broadcasting wheat. Brian just touched on the soil to seed contact. Broadcasting doesn't exactly lend itself to that. So Joanna, this was a situation, I think, this year where we did get a timely rain kind of right after a lot of that went on. But what are the risks risks if I'm going to broadcast wheat into a standing soybean crop, let's say?
So to me, I think one of the greatest risks is depending on how that broadcast is occurring. If you're broadcasting into standing soybeans, there's always that risk of having contaminated seed end up in your soybean crop. And so I think that's something to really be aware of and be cautious of. And if you're doing that, probably have a way of ensuring that you have clean soybean seed. So whether that you have the ability to clean that seed, because if we get that contaminated seed in there, you could essentially be outright rejected. So that can be a real concern, especially if utilizing treated seed. We also, because like you said, you have to have good seed to soil contact. There are going to be losses there in terms of what we see at the end of the day of a final stand. So we need to make sure we're upping our seeding rates. Generally speaking, starting at 2 million seeds per acre is what a lot of folks who are broadcasting are using. And then of course, there's also going to be the risk of insect feeding because you've got those seeds sitting there on the soil surface. I would definitely say making sure that you have a high enough seeding rate, and also just being aware of the fact that there are some risks associated with contaminating that soybean crop, which are very real. But broadcast seeding is something. It has, I think, a good fit in certain places, especially areas where obviously the soybeans are late. But if you've got wet ground or ground that gets wet very quickly in the fall, and you really want to get that cereal in the rotation, broadcast seeding winter cereal is a great option for those kinds of scenarios for sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Right. And so that's the key point with treated seed. That is the one thing we absolutely cannot have that in our soybeans. So a huge red flag there. Brian, you have I wanted, Producer Jay, could you bring up, I believe it's slide 1 of Brian's? Because I am curious about this because we've talked about putting stuff in very, very late. We're going to talk about ideal windows, of course. But walk me through this so that it makes sense, because I reviewed it and I'm not that smart. So I have you on here to explain it to me. So explain this to me.
Okay, so just real quick, because I think I talked a little bit about this last time I was on about nitrogen, but basically the arrows that you see on those bars, and it's comparing winter wheat to spring wheat. So why does winter wheat give us better yield, right? Because out here in the West, typically general rule of thumb, 20% greater yield. Well, if you look at the top bar graph there, you'll see that the arrow with the winter wheat is a little bit bigger, right? It's lengthened out a bit. So that's the critical growth period. And with the spring wheat, especially on the prairies, because if it's planted later like that, or not later, but even conventionally, a big part of that critical growth period is where it's in July, where we have this year was just classic. Almost to the 1st of July, we hit, terminal drought, and anything over 31 degrees and higher is just going to kill florets. So you go back to the comments about seed set and all that. So it's not about winter wheat gives us higher yield because it's out there longer. It's about the fact that it's shifted away from those really high temperatures, and it's also taking advantage of moisture when it's available. So the plants are up at a stage where it can really take advantage of it. And so by those sort of factors, then you can lengthen out that critical growth period. And that's how you really maximize yield. And the bottom one is just examples of the UK for winter wheat, which is they have awesome conditions because they never get hot, right? And same with spring wheat in Chile, for example. They get the radiation, but they don't get the terminal heat. And that's why, 11-ton wheat in Chile is normal in some places. And so the idea that we could do that here on the prairies is a bit of a fallacy. But there are things that we could tweak around that critical growth period. And that's kind of why we, worked on the ultra early spring wheat seeding project too. And it gets it out of that. It gets that critical growth period shifted out.
So, so this is, and maybe Jay, if we leave this up for a bit, it's part of that thought process, exactly that. Joanna, this year, certainly we had some pretty incredible wheat potential because we had such a mild winter and an early break of dormancy. But then we did get, just like the West did as well, even though the wheat was earlier, we still got that incredible heat during that critical time.
Yeah, right. Right up until probably about June the 17th, I believe it was, we really thought we were going to have some record-breaking yields. We had the head counts were there, or the stand counts were there, but once the grain fill period, we got into that grain fill period in those earlier stages, we got hit with, I think it was 30 plus degrees for 7 days in a row or so. And yeah, just as Brian described, unfortunately, that really took the yield off the top, and we still had excellent yields, I would say, compared to the 10-year average, but we absolutely got dinged, I think, on that weather that week.
And if the straw yield is any indication, there was like incredible amounts of biomass, but just we didn't get the grain fill that we needed. So now that does bring up, so this is for wheat, but we have a few other options, certainly, that we can talk about. Winter barley. Which one would be the, Joanna, for here in Ontario anyway, but it's similar, between winter triticale, winter barley, and cereal rye? Where do they fall in as far as which one's earliest in the growing season for harvest if we're taking it to grain?
So we'll start quickly maybe on seeding a little bit. So for winter barley and triticale, those both need to be about 10 to 14 days prior to winter wheat.
When we put them in.
Yeah, when we're planting. So we need to establish those quite a bit earlier in order for winter survival. We also like to see those tillers from those crops in particular in the fall. And triticale tends to tiller quite rapidly in the fall. Rye will be the earliest to mature out of all of them. So if you're looking for a really early season, it's one to go with. Winter barley is about 1 to 2 weeks prior to winter wheat. And then winter triticale, so rye is the earliest, winter triticale is about 10 days or so after rye, and then winter barley will be after that. But with rye, there are some challenges in that if you're taking it for forage, there is a very critical window that crop needs to be harvested. And then it also begins to rapidly advance when we're trying to target that time. So it's one that doesn't leave maybe as much flexibility, whereas with triticale, there are a bit more options depending on whether you want to take it for a forage, let's say flyleaf, or you want to take it more of like kind of a silage, so to speak. You could take that a little bit later. So there's a bit more flexibility with that one. But both of those provide great options then to be able to go in and double crop corn silage after the fact. And a lot of dairy farmers are doing that and seeing some pretty great results in terms of feed volume, even though they're taking a bit of a yield penalty by selecting, say, a shorter season corn silage because of the yield they're getting off of that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That is a good reminder for those of us who plan on taking it for forage that we better be ready when the rye is ready. We shall not be dragging our feet next spring. Okay, we're going to go to our clip because I want to spend some time on seeding rates. This is always a big question so timing is always a big question, and seeding rates are always a big question. So we're going to hop to, this is a clip from a recent wheat school with Peter Wheatbeat Johnson, who can't be here tonight, everybody, so we can take all the pot shots we want, talking about, of course, deciding on that seeding rate. So produce Jay, if you would.
Seed rate. I've already mentioned it, but I plant early. Two things happen. Number one, I have lots of time for that wheat plant to develop fall tillers. Fall tillers add huge yield. But if I plant too many plants, I get a whole lot of plant-to-plant competition, and I can actually get into fall disease. Plus, the taller the plants, the more lodging prone they are. The way you manage that is seeding rate. Look at gocrops.ca. Look at your optimum seeding date. Here at Plattsville, it's probably somewhere around September the 20th. If you're 10 days ahead of that, drop your seeding rate. Drop it significantly. 1 to 1.2 million seeds per acre if you're on loam soils, down to 1.2, 1.4 if you're on heavy clay. As we get later, we'll seed more, but manage lodging, manage tillering with that seeding rate. And by the way, if you tell me it's 3 bushels per acre, then just go away, because when was the last time you seeded a half a bushel of corn per acre? I challenge you next spring, don't seed 32,000 plants of corn, half a bushel, because that's what you're doing to my wonderful wheat crop. And that just doesn't work.
Thank you to our show sponsors, the Successors, Nutrien eKonomics, and RealAg Shops. RealAg Shops is a video series brought to you by Princess Auto. In this series, check out smart and slick shops from across Canada. Do you know someone who has a great shop? Nominate them for a tour by emailing shaney@realagriculture.com. Check out RealAg Shops on our YouTube channel. So my favorite, we're going to seed in bushels per acre. Brian, can I seed in bushels per acre?
I agree with Pete on that, although I thought we were up in Canada, so I'm not too sure about this million seeds per acre stuff either. So
okay, this is fantastic. Okay, so if we're going to talk about pounds per acre or seeds per acre, how do you handle that question, right? Joanna's going to lose her mind. Brian, how do we handle the seeding rate question for the West? In drier situations in the West, where are we going?
I think if you throw up that one slide of ours that's got the is it slide 3?
I think it's either 3 or I want to say it's 3.
It's 3, yeah. Like, I mean, everything's to seed spatially, which is what we want, including you know, the seeds per acre. It boils down to kernel weight. So you got to know your seed lot, you got to know your kernel weight.
Yeah.
Because if you don't, you ultimately have to convert it back to a volume, so you know how much weight you're going in based on that kernel weight to give you the spatial density you're after. But the idea that, you know, we can cheat back on seeding rates with winter wheat, I think we sort of addressed that to some degree with this project that we did, both at Lethbridge, you know, which some would argue, all, you know, that's kind of like the Bible or the Sun Belt, Bible Belt to Sun Belt, and when it comes to growing winter wheat, but whatever. But this was also in Lacombe, and this is an average of the two. But if you look at that gray bar, horizontal bar, and we agree that at a minimum, even with spring or winter, we want to be 20 plants per square foot or more, preferably way more. What rate of seeds going in the ground in the fall got us there? And the answer here is, if you cheated back and went with 300 versus the 450 versus the 600, if you cheated it back and only went 30 seeds per square foot, you fell under a lot of times from that, and that there you paid a price for it. So the seeding rate thing to me is like, I can't always tell you, you know, if you go up to a higher seeding rate, it'll always convert to a yield that you're satisfied with. But we always ignore the intangible benefits of a higher seeding rate. And, you know, we can talk, maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later. I don't know. But, you know, there's reams and reams of intangible benefits that come from a higher seeding rate versus cheating. And it's not to say that a lower seeding rate won't work. Like, it's all sort of, it all boils down to how much stress did that crop, you know, absorb throughout the growing season. If it's in a low stress environment, you can go with really low seeding rates and be real happy. Especially like there's you know, down in the US, like around Kansas and that, I've got colleagues down there that, I mean, it's almost the opposite, where they sort of advocate for lower seeding rates because the yield champion did it with, you know, so many low population densities and so on. So it's, you know, for me though, in the northern latitudes, like, we're not talking hybrid canola seed costs here. We're talking cereal seed costs. And to me, it's a fairly cheap insurance policy, because that's what I'm looking at when I look at a lot of the agronomic factors. It's like, you know, everything is $10 an acre. So when you stack on how many practices that get you to $10 an acre, which are the ones that really paid the premium, versus the ones that didn't.
Mm-hmm. Now, okay, so and we are going to come back to where seeding rate plays out in a few other things, whether that's weed competition, etc. But Joanna, one of the things I think about in Ontario is we can have months between when the first winter wheat seed goes in and the last. And it makes sense to me that we would adjust based on, even to Brian's point, if we've got good moisture and good growing conditions, good soil conditions, we don't necessarily want to be throwing in a whole bunch of seed that we don't necessarily need. But how do we work it back to heads per, I think, is it meter squared or heads per square foot, right? Because in the YEN project, in the Yield Enhancement Network project, that's one of the factors that is being measured and seems to be translating to yield potential. So maybe explain that a little bit, how that works in the YEN project.
Yeah, so what we found in both the YEN project and the work that was done by Emma Dillman at the University of Guelph is that with the earlier planting dates, we tend to have much higher heads per meter square, which in turn is ultimately turning into these higher yields. So in the Yield Enhancement Network, for example, last year, the high yielding producers, which had 100, when I say top 20, it's the top 20% of producers in the program, had an average yield of 148 bushels per acre. And they had a heads per meter square count of about 870 heads per meter square. Whereas the low 20%, which had an average yield of 90 bushels, so we have a 50 bushel yield difference there, they had an average stand count of 553 heads per meter square. So we really want to target that 600 plus heads per meter square. Now, in the work that's been done, and I'm not sure if we have this slide that we can put up, but essentially what we find is that earlier planting dates always result in higher heads per meter square. But the question we get is, can we account for a later planting date with seeding rate? And so we, in the work that Dennis Pennington now has done in Michigan State, he looked at this. So he looked at a middle of September planting date all the way to November. And what he found was that even if you increase that seeding rate accordingly based to our recommendations, you can never get to that same yield potential or that same accounts as you can with those earlier seeding dates. So those earlier seeding dates just allows those early tillers to develop, and that ultimately results in more heads per meter square. If we got more tillers early on, more biomass, and ultimately more yield. And so, yeah, you can see here on the slide on the screen on those early planting dates or mid-early, which is about a week prior to our optimum date for your window in Ontario, to right on time, you can see we're always above in those orange and blue squares above the 700 heads per meter square. Whereas those mid-late to late planting dates, we could never achieve the same heads per meter square. So planting date really, in terms of economics, like I really think planting date is one of the most economical or easiest economical ways to increase your yields without any extra costs. It takes a bit more planning and management in terms of, selecting the right soybean varieties, figuring out your rotation if you can get some Mizukis in there, even planting after corn silage if you're on a livestock operation. Those are some of the ways, or winter canola. Those are great ways to try to get that wheat planted early. And while seeding rate will help with that, again, it just won't totally get you back to that original yield potential.
Okay. So now there is a risk in this environment of too high a seeding rate. And as
Yes.
Mark says, too high and it just lays down and you can't pick it back up. We heard Pete sort of allude to some of the issues. So yeah, so what happens with our too high, and is there anything we can do about it if we end up with too fat of a crop?
So as Peter said, he was right on the money. There's growers, particularly in Michigan, now they are on 5-inch rows, so slightly lower than our typical 7.5-inch rows. They're seeding at 800,000 seeds per acre to 1 million seeds per acre and achieving these 160, 170 bushel yields. And those lower seeding rates at those earlier planting dates is probably number one in terms of managing that lodging risk. And that's why we really need to watch our seeding rate on those earlier planting dates. And so every week that we move along, we can up our seeding rates by about 200,000 seeds per acre is our general recommendation. And that'll help manage that lodging risk. Then, of course, is selecting the right variety. So if you're a farmer with lots of manure on your farm, just really good soil organic matter, good mineralization, definitely select a variety that stands well, good standability. And then, of course, splitting our nitrogen as well as PGRs are other tools that we can utilize in the spring to help with that. But seeding rate is also going to be a big key part of that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Producer Jay, can you bring up, I think it's Brian's slide, I want to say 5 is the one with the seeding rate differences. There we go. Okay, so and Brian, I'm glad you submitted this and that we can talk about this, because sometimes we think about all the decisions that we make that add up to different things, and how they can play into things like weed suppression. But this one is actually looking at fungicide insecticide differences. So walk me through this trial.
Yeah, so it also it also took into account, like, what if you have a less than ideal seed lot?
Right.
So for example, and you didn't really recognize that necessarily, and then you cheated your seed rates too. So if you look at the upper left hand, which would be the low input sort of strategy. So in this particular scenario, the producer had a fairly light seed lot in terms of seed weight. He or she cheated and went 20 seeds per square foot, or 200 seeds per square meter, and then they elected not to use a seed treatment. So the picture on the right of that, the upper right, is the exact same seed lot and seeding rate, except they used a dual fungicide insecticide seed treatment. So and so that was really the study that made me a disciple of not using seed treatments for biotic stresses, but just for what it can do in terms of resistance to abiotic stress, which includes the need usually to have that neonic component. And then below the bottom left is no seed treatment, but it's at a higher seeding rate. And then the one to the right of that is an added seed treatment. So I think you all know which one you would pick. You know, and it's a better seed lot as well. So, I think it was a really cool study that way. Now somebody, and maybe somebody's going to point it out there as well in the comments, is like, okay, well, what if I just went and took that upper right photo, cheated my seeding rates, and added a seeding rate or a seed treatment? Sorry.
Yeah.
It's a good point, because you would probably get the same yield at times to that bottom right picture. The problem is, what we also saw in the study was your yield stability. So, the field to field, year to year would be a bit of a yo-yo with that upper right versus the bottom right. So you stabilize things, back to the insurance policy, what you're going to get based on what you've done there. And that's how much you value that's what you're going to get in payback in terms of the upper right versus the bottom right.
So it does also, though, I think, so certainly seed lot differences, yes, but then seeding, we add onto a seed lot difference, we add a seeding rate difference, and then we also choose a seed treatment. So when we start to layer some of these things, we really can see some significant differences between, and as you mentioned, the yield stability part, which is really important. So that predictability of what we might be able to get out of that crop.
Yeah.
So I do like, this is the light seed versus heavy seed, and the seeding rate is pretty impressive when we start to compare some of these things, which is pretty cool. Now, I do want to touch on seeding depth, and Mark has corrected himself, saying that on the clay they drill 2.5 inches minimum because of frost heaving. Brian, that's when there's moisture in the soil and the ground. No, I'm just kidding. But so heaving, of course, for any of our fall established crops can definitely be an issue, especially on those clays. So Joanna, Mark saying he seeds deeper because of frost heaving. Is that the only sort of management I can do in the spring, or should I also be adjusting seeding rates on clays, or is it actually the opposite of what you think? You actually seed fewer, but make sure you get them lower? How do I deal with that?
So for seeding depth, generally speaking, we want it to be 1 inch to 1.5 inches. It can be very difficult to get that inch. This is just on a typical soil. It can be very difficult to get that inch. So we typically are targeting 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches to just get it there. Now, when it comes to heavy clay soils, it is absolutely critical that we do not shallow plant on clay soils because of frost heaving in particular. So we absolutely need to be aiming for about 1.5 inches. And in some situations, obviously, if it's too dry, we need to go deeper. But on those soils in particular, frost heaving can be a real concern. You'll think your stand looks fine come spring, then you'll actually get out there and start to dig up or look at some of the plants, and you'll actually just see they're hanging by a little hair, and those plants will proceed to die as the spring progresses, especially if we have a lot of cool up and down temperatures, wet soils. So Mark is right. On those heavy clay soils, we definitely need to absolutely be aiming for 1.5 inches. It takes about 50 growing degree days for the seed to germinate, or 80 growing degree days for the seed to germinate, and another 50 growing degree days for every inch of seeding depth for it to emerge. So if we go too deep, what happens in the fall, especially for planting later, is that we're taking that much time for that seed or that plant to actually emerge, and we don't want that. We want to get that crop out of the ground as quickly as possible. So on a typical soil, you don't want to be going any more than 1.5 inches, but on a heavy clay, that's probably about where you should be starting to make sure that it's in the ground and you're not going to have issues with frost heaving.
Mm-hmm. So now, Brian, I think about winter kill still being a huge drawback in many parts of the prairies for making winter wheat specifically, but fall seeded crops in general, a part of the rotation. Jason Vogt shares that biggest issue in South Central Manitoba is winter kill. They also would have a lot of clay as well. But Brian, from your perspective on, what typically gets a winter wheat crop that does winter kill, is it just exposure because we don't have the snow cover, or what usually is our winter kill issue?
Well, I guess it depends on how widespread it is in a field. Like if you have a lot of frost and like a freezing and thawing period of time where you get a bunch of snow and it does thaw, later it almost approaching spring and then it freezes back up and you get ice encasement. That's usually when you get a complete write-off when it comes to winter kill. The rest of it tends to be patchy and spotty if it does happen. And that more relates potentially to issues with topography along the field and that sort of thing. And you can buffer that a little bit, I would argue, with things like a seed treatment, the right variety, planting density, and so on. But there's really nothing to defend against ice encasement. If that happens, no matter what variety of practice you have, it's all cards are off the table and it's a goner. So, the upside to winter wheat is that you got an opportunity to do something in that field if that happens. So that's sort of the benefit. So as long as like the input costs with your winter wheat are moderate to on the lower side versus the rest of the cropping system, that gives you an opportunity to maybe still, be somewhat in the black even if that happens. But if you're 100% spring wheat grower and you're planting late, what do you do then if you have a train wreck then? So that's kind of the counter, I would say, to those that don't want to give winter wheat a try.
Mm-hmm. Warren would like to point out that he's had an issue with geese, and there is no seed treatment for geese. Warren, I think you just have to start wearing scary costumes and running out on your field at inopportune times, and scaring them away. But geese are a serious issue. Like when they're not super, in huge numbers, maybe not, but in large enough numbers, they will wipe out a field. So anyway, and they don't even taste good, you guys. This is it's like insult to injury. Anyway,
yeah,
Brian,
we talked about this last time. I was
we talked about this last time. We talked about
sky rats. Remember sky rats?
Sky rats. Okay. So but that does bring up. So Brian, you bring up a good point though about, a winter wheat crop or a winter cereal crop that fails, you still have an option to grow a crop because you still have a spring option. So Jason's point with the winter kill issues in Manitoba is this is where he's more interested in the ultra early seeding. So eliminating that risk of overwintering, but trying to get in there super early. Now, so explain to me, what is ultra early seeding in your context? Because this isn't necessarily frost seeding, or is it? So explain to me this ultra early
No,
seeding.
it's not.
Okay.
So if I could just quickly interject on the depth thing,
Yes.
if like we've done this before, we've done some work on this before out west on the prairies. If you go too deep, you lose vigor big time. So imagine what happens to that crop if you're already starting with less vigor at the time you drilled it in. So keep that in mind when it comes to your winter survival success as well. Like and I just got a text from a farmer in Saskatchewan who's a big winter wheat advocate, and he said, talk about depth, because some guys are drilling too deep and they're having issues with it. And the thing I would say about winter wheat generally is, like, a spring wheat grower can have train wreck after train wreck and they're going to grow spring wheat. One train wreck with winter wheat and they're like, I'm never growing that friggin'
Ever
crop
again.
Oh,
Yeah. So
it's so true. Come on, guys. Yeah. All right.
so yeah.
Okay. Okay.
And honestly, and I'll be totally honest, I've been doing winter wheat agronomy for decades, and I was banging my head against the wall, seeing the acreage go up and down. And I was like, and I had growers asking about, spring wheat and when you could plant, and no one had really deviated from conventional date type, arbitrary calendar date seeding type stuff. So to make a long story short, I was just like, let's try something different, and just no matter when it is, as soon as we reach the desired temperature that we coined the temperature trigger, we plant no matter what. And the earliest it's been here, and that being zero, above zero in the top 2 inches, was February 9th here in Lethbridge. So for ultra early, it's field conditions that still allow you to plant properly. But for us, and it's not just us, like, we went as far north as Dawson Creek, and they're not doing it February 9th, but they are doing it way earlier than what the coffee shop jargon said you should be doing it at. So that's ultra early planting. Now the dormant thing relates to both winter wheat and spring wheat too, where I can't get in when I want to get in, so I'm going to go and just put it in when the conditions allow. So that's sort of the Western context, is you still need to be able to get in at a time where the field conditions allow good to seed soil contact. Whereas frost seeding is a little bit more of a action movie type approach, where you're like going in on this, you're taking your equipment on this frost, hoping you don't break through, and you just kind of skim it in. And Bill Dean showed that it can work really well. So risk wise higher, but it can work.
Certainly this year, Joanna, we saw oats went in super early. There are people that put in oats ridiculously early because you could. So I guess my thinking with Jason's question in southern Manitoba, like, one of your points, Brian, is using soil temperature as the trigger, not calendar. But what about conditions? Because I just think, like, I lived in Manitoba for most of my life, and even if it was relatively warm, it would still be very soupy. So how, like, what do soil conditions have to be like if it's that warm? Do you still have to be able to make a nice seed bed? Like, you don't want to make a mess?
Yeah, exactly. Like, we're not saying it's going to work every year, every place. Somebody's asking, how'd you get the openers in? If we showed you the video, it looked like we were planting in May.
There was no snow, Mark. This is southern Alberta. There was no snow. It was dry as a bone. Yeah.
And we've had growers throughout Saskatchewan as well that have tried it, and their point was, we knew we could go. We knew that field was ready, but we did not know the risks. And this project kind of allowed them to have the confidence that you're not going to assume any risk. Like, is it going to snow like crazy and be way below zero for weeks on end after you plant? Yeah, it is.
Maybe.
Is that a big deal? Everybody thought that's a huge deal, and it wasn't. You know,
Yeah.
what? Oh, well, it's gonna get hit by frost. Then, yeah, it might. Do you know what happened? Nothing. You know, because wheat's
Yeah.
really resilient. You know, it's not
Yeah.
canola. We're not saying do this with canola,
Right.
but with wheat, it
Yeah.
really kind of shifted how we think about when we should plant or what should go in first.
Mm-hmm.
It has
Or-
9 lives, as they say.
That's right. You got to kill it. You got to kill it like 3 or 4 times before you're going to get a crop out of it. So give her a go. Now, Warren also said, I've long said if you were to look at winter wheat like we do at corn, we'd keep almost every stand. This is the other thing. Sometimes I'm really surprised, even just around where I am. I've seen some fields get taken out, and I thought, I'm pretty sure we could have made something out of it. But that's a whole other show. Just quickly, I want to pause just quickly. We need to do our last read of the night. And then there's a few sort of quick hits I want to do because we've got some great visuals to look at as well. So Producer Jay, if you would. Our sponsors for the Agronomists are Nutrien eKonomics, RealAg Shops, and the Successors. Real Agriculture highlights the next generation of agriculture, the up-and-comers. Featuring interviews with the young crowd, the Successors dives into mentorship, marketing, implementing new ideas, careers outside the farm, and so much more. Download from Real Agriculture's podcast feed wherever you get your podcasts. Jason, even if it's warm and sunny, you open a canola bag of seed and it screams at you to close the bag up. That's right. There you go. So Jim, who is in southwestern Saskatchewan, very dry area, says he always thought frost would take it out, but had to have normal planted durum with Adidas stripes. What? From frost, that was fine. Okay, I get it. The Adidas stripes from frost, and it was fine. But Farmer Jim, I don't know that I would do this with durum. Or Brian, have you tried these things with durum?
Yeah, we're currently wrapping up a study funded by Sask Wheat that was on durum because our first project didn't look at durum, and we thought there was all kinds of anecdotal data that it would work or it wouldn't work. So we were like, we got to do this, and it worked just fine.
Okay.
So yeah, give her, Jim.
Yep. Yeah, there you go. In between all the shelter belts of Carriganas. That's how Farmer Jim farms, and we love it. Okay, Joanna, you've got some great shots that, and this I thought, so I sat in on a talk you did just last week, I think, time is flying, and looking at some of our other options, and winter barley is one of them, and one of the things you brought up that I thought was really important was that in the spring, winter barley looks dead, and don't panic. So we were just talking about taking out stands maybe before they were ready. So walk me through, if I am choosing winter barley, what do I need to think about, and tell me it's not dead. That's important.
Yeah, so winter wheat, when it comes out of winter, you get that nice green up effect. The tissue all is there. It looks like it's coming to life. But with winter barley, it'll essentially look like what we would think is a dead winter wheat field. So you'll see a lot of tissue dead there, but you have to give it a bit more time in the spring than winter wheat for it to actually really green up, and you'll start to see that new growth. Whereas something like triticale even as well, it'll nicely green up much like winter wheat, but winter barley is a little bit different. So it's it's not a new crop to Ontario, but it's a growing crop in Ontario. So lots of new growers. And I get this question almost every spring. They're upset because their winter barley field died, when in fact, it just needs a bit more time to green up. So I share that comment, especially for new growers. It freaks them out a little bit, but just be a little bit patient and you will see that new growth coming through with it there. I don't know if we've got those photos, but
I think Producer Jay, I think it's slide, I want to say, where is it here? Yeah, go with
slide 11.
11
or 12. Actually, 12 is probably better. Sorry.
Yeah, but 11 or 12, and we can look at a couple of these. There we go. So
Yes, you can see there's a lot of dead tissue there. But yeah, once you actually pull away some of that dead tissue, you'll see that nice green material coming through. And then I don't know if Jay can show the next slide as well,
Yep.
but you can see what the same plots look like a little bit later in the season. And voila, you have a beautiful winter barley crop there. So that's one to keep in mind. Another thing to look out with winter barley, especially because we plant it so early, and we were on that topic of discussion around seed treatments, is that it tends to be quite a bit more prone to barley yellow dwarf virus. And when we get a fall infection, we can see yield losses up to 30%. So with winter barley, we want to be on the lookout for it in winter wheat. We did see quite a bit of it in Ontario this past year because of the mild fall we had last year. But with winter barley in particular, a seed treatment, I think, is absolutely necessary just to help manage that barley yellow dwarf virus. You won't totally eliminate it, but you'll be able to reduce the amount of feeding that occurs in your field. So it's a great option, especially if you're a livestock producer looking for an alternative to corn. Winter barley is really excellent. And if you're in the south and love double crop opportunities, winter barley is another great option for that.
Okay. I'm a big fan of these extra I know, surprising, right? That it's for livestock. Okay. So yeah, producer Jay, could you bring up, so this is the image that I sent you from the soybean field. This is our cereal rye that we had droned on. I wanted to share this because I know we've talked about seeding by drone. So this is a week ago. So the beans have since dropped all those leaves, but this is about not quite 3 weeks of growth. But this went on, I think we might have the clip. This went on when only the very bottom leaves had just started to turn. And I can't take credit for it, but it was right ahead of all this hot weather. And so in a more average year, I have a feeling we wouldn't have seen such a quick leaf drop and opening of that canopy. But it got droned on. Like, I was a little nervous that it was too soon. So I'm a little like, it looks like we have a good catch. Now, this is, again, to Brian's point about, not a lot to lose. We'll probably put some sheep on it very early for very early spring grazing, and then we're going to take it for forage. So like, we are not trying to pay for our mortgage with this particular field. But it's an experiment and it seems to be going okay. So
I think it's cool. I mean, rye, it's the one that requires the least amount of management, to be honest, and still get really great yields, especially for someone looking for forage. It has the best winter survival of all the cereals, and it can be grown on marginal land. So if you're in those scenarios, or you're something like this where you're going to graze it and then take another cut, it's, I think, a really great option. And I know myself, I don't have a ton of experience with the drone application of this, so I'm really excited to see how this turns out this year.
If it's a total flop, I'm never talking to any of you again. Just so you know. Okay, we got a question here for Brian. Is fertility, in particular, and the application rate and timing, do they differ a lot with ultra early seeding versus more traditional seeding? Great question. So if we're doing ultra early seeding, this is spring wheat that's gone in well ahead of the usual calendar date. How am I going to address the fertility situation? Great question, Jason.
So the fertility issue doesn't really change. And if you've followed some of the work that we've done on nitrogen with wheat, a lot of it boils down to producer preference in terms of their logistics, whether they want to band it all, which is sort of the least risky, because if you think of the source sink that we talked about last time I was on, sometimes if you're late with that application of N to fully meet the N needs of the plant, you're not going to sink that source sink, and the sink is the seeds, right? So if you short yourself there, you're going to short yourself on yield. So that's why it's often hard to beat everything at planting. But do you want to handle all the bulk? Maybe not. So not a big difference there. The only thing that changes a bit is that probably want to plan a bit more about your pre-seed herbicide application, because obviously there may not be weeds out when you want to go plant, and that's actually a good thing. But there are things like, your residual herbicides that you could put down in fall if there's enough planting in place that allow you to have some herbicide control ahead of planting for ultra early, that is.
Mm-hmm. Joanna, Pete would never talk to, speaking of not talking to people, Pete would not speak to any of us if we didn't mention that the nitrogen in the fall, no, not necessarily with wheat, but phosphorus. So that nitrogen question, for winter wheat, we're not putting N down in the fall, right?
No, typically it'll be just whatever's in your MAP. So if you're putting 100 pounds of MAP, you're probably putting about 10 pounds of nitrogen down. So there's a lot of environmental risk with putting that nitrogen in Ontario. At least it's a little bit different for Western Canada, I recognize. And so really where we are seeing the most benefit from is fall applied phosphorus. On heavy clay soils in particular, even at higher soil test levels, they're seeing a pretty significant response there. And so I think phosphorus is another cost-effective way of increasing your yields. It helps keep that crop nice and uniform, improves winter survival, and is there, especially in the springtime when we have, again, tough growing conditions. It just really helps get that plant through. There's been a lot of discussion, and maybe I'll regret bringing this up. And actually, I'm seeing Mark put a comment in the chat about sulfur. In all of the Ontario research, this has been a big debate lately, but in all the Ontario research that has been done to date, we aren't seeing the same responses to that sulfur application in the fall compared to the spring. So we get very strong responses to spring applied sulfur, especially in that first application. So if you're splitting your nitrogen, we want to see the bulk of that sulfur, which is now getting in the upwards of 20 to 25 pounds. We want to see that in that first application in the spring when the soils are cool, that crop starts to increase, or rapid uptake begins to, or the wheat starts to go into rapid uptake. We want to have that sulfur there for the crop. We're not seeing the same responses to that sulfur applied in the fall. However, there is some research coming out of Michigan with Kurt Sankey in particular, where he is seeing some of the responses to fall applied sulfur that we're seeing in the spring. So I do think that there's something to look into more there, but I will say that in any of the research to date, it's all spring applied sulfur where we see the value compared to fall applied, along with the MAP. Yeah.
Brian, is the sulfur question a tough one for the West, or are we really mostly worried about our nitrogen and we've got our sulfur figured out?
Yeah, I wouldn't worry about it. Like, unless there's something in a soil test that alerts you to it. But I mean, it's going to be taken care of in probably your canola phase or something like that, where there's more of a need for it. Back to this thing about seed treatments for abiotic threats instead of the biotic piece. I kind of like the sulfur context for disease resistance. That intrigues me. So these guys that are applying sulfur, kind of a 4-year cycle. So every field gets it 1 out of every 4 years or whatever, like regardless of the crop. And they're doing it to sort of manage disease. That intrigues me. I'm kind of a newbie around that, but I mean, based on what we've seen on seed treatments for abiotic stress and what we know about potentially what sulfur could do around disease resistance, that's interesting.
So, and I think one of the key differences here is because we have such a huge sulfur user in rotation, to your point, farmers already have the sulfur question in the rotation because the canola is there and they're answering it. So we're likely not short once that wheat goes in. Whereas in Ontario, the sky used to give us the sulfur and it doesn't anymore. So now we have to add it, and we don't have a big user like canola, although more so all the time. So just to quickly touch on some good comments here on the broadcast seeding. So Warren says broadcast has to be super early for success. In heavy soil, you need the leaves to seed the wheat or it struggles to germinate. So this is one of the things that the drone operator said. Yes, you want the leaves to fall onto the seed, not the other way around. And Billy Beaudry says they do broadcast seeding on winter wheat and soybeans for many years. A big rain right after is super important. And so we almost had to stop because of the rain, and then it rained a nice inch the next day. So I'm going to take full credit for that as well. But that's just how it worked. So I mean, a lot of things to consider, but we're hoping it worked well. But it really does come down to weather, of course, deciding all these things for sure. Now we did touch on depth, which I think is good. Joanna's also got some good slides, so I just want to touch on just briefly the half-inch versus an inch depth that Mike Cobra did. Was that the work that Mike did?
Yeah,
Can you just
so
walk us
it
through
was
that
that.
quickly?
Don't tell
Yeah.
him I put this in there. So
Well,
it was
just
actually
he's
an
a weeds
accident.
guy.
It was an
Yeah, what's he
accident
doing?
that
Yeah,
turned into a great research trial.
yeah,
And it just really highlights the importance of seeding depth and getting it to at least an inch. At least in on parts of Ontario that don't get a lot of snow cover, winter kill can be a huge problem. So on the heavy clay soils, heaving can be an issue. Whereas on other soils, it's those fluctuations in temperatures in the springtime that are most critical. And so if you are a half-inch seeding depth and that crown gets frozen off, we'll see a lot of kill there, and hopefully we can get that photo.
yeah. I believe it is. I want to say maybe slide.
Oh, sorry.
I want to say it's. Oh goodness, hang on. I'll check for you, Jay, because it's a really good one. It's 6 maybe. Hang on. Nope.
9.
9. There we go. See, I'm just somewhat dyslexic.
I
There we
sent too
go.
many. Sorry.
No, it's okay. We got it. Okay, yes. So like this is a stark difference. This is fantastic.
And so essentially this can make or break your entire crop. So if you seed that entire field at a half-inch versus an inch, this was one pass that turned into a great photo and just story around the importance of seeding depth. But you can see there that targeting optimum seeding to 8 or seeding depth of an inch is really critical. But again, on heavier clay soils, that tends to be a little bit deeper just because of the issue or concern with frost heaving.
Yeah, absolutely. Stunning. Like it looks the half-inch, like it looks like something killed it, but something did. But like I mean, like it looks like an insect, or it looks like a disease, or right. But it literally the only difference was seeding depth, which is stunning.
Yeah, and we've been lucky the last 2 years or 3 years to have really good winters for ourselves. But if we get a typical winter again, this becomes very critical.
Okay, so back to your point earlier.
Yeah.
This makes for a nice discussion. Would you write that off?
Such a good point. On the right. So yeah, that's a good question. Warren, let's ask Warren, who says we should treat it like a corn crop. Would we keep that stand or would we tear it out? Because I'm going to guess most people would tear it out. Brian, you look at that and you think that's a bin buster for Lethbridge. I'm just kidding. Lethbridge grows amazing crops. You guys have your.
No, I mean, you have that tillering capacity of winter wheat, right? And like, I know, to your point, even out here, like, I mean, people would walk away from crops that, somebody gets in there and actually does a count and they decide to keep it. And it turned out okay. It wasn't like, you're not going to brag about it in the coffee shop, but it turned out okay.
Yeah.
I would say it really depends on the health of the plants too. Like if those plants are very healthy, they're evenly spread out through the field. And to Brian's point, if there's tillering capacity there, you might consider keeping it. But if those plants are already kind of stressed out on hanging on for dear life, then that makes a difference. We typically say if you're in less than 7 plants per foot of row, you take it out. 8 to 10 plants is where you kind of weigh the alternatives and you decide, okay, what are these plants like? And then if it's higher than that, if you're 11 plants per foot of row and you still have the potential for tillering, I would absolutely keep that stand. So I think it just really depends on kind of, the overall health of those plants and distribution.
And how busy you are. Maybe you got things to do. Yeah. Warren says, heck no, more corn. That's Warren's answer for everything. So don't even.
Hey, he's a newfound wheat grower now. And he loves it.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. More wheat. Okay. Brian just shares, so further to the sulfur question, fall 10 pounds of sulfur plot. So he's sharing that definitely the spring versus fall applied sulfur definitely makes a difference. And that the best difference was at 19 bushels difference. Which is pretty significant when splitting it that way. Okay, so Jason adds, and I know we're over time here, but so looking at that stand, Brian, if you were to walk out in that field and see that, let's say you were in that 10, 11 plants per foot a row or that tipping point, would you add N to get it going and get it tillering? How would you manage it?
I mean, it depends on how much I put down in the fall, but I would probably hold off a bit. knowing that this is going to be a low input phase for me, that I'm kind of just looking to break even or shift
Right.
markets or something on. So I wouldn't go crazy with the end until I saw a little bit further down where I maybe applied in crop, just to see what the weather's doing and whatnot. If there was rain on the horizon, I'd probably hit it personally. And then I noticed Ray's got some good comments in the text around not having a beer with them in the garage, but having comments about the sulfur
That's
point.
right.
So
Yeah.
it's good to have a guy like that in the audience for sure.
Yes. Ask your questions of Ray. And I have yet to be invited for a beer at Ray's, so in the garage. But Mark says it depends if you have the wheat pre-sold at $12 a bushel or not. Yes. Okay. So when the
Yeah,
stand looks a little
exactly.
uncertain, it does depend on how much you need it to yield, or how much you have pre-sold. So absolutely, a lot of things. Okay, we are out of time. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Joanna. This was so much fun. We have covered a lot, not nearly as much as I want to, but still some. So of course, I invite and fantastic comments and questions in the comments as well. Really appreciate it. If anybody has any follow-up questions or anything they want us to dig into, just get in touch with me, and I can of course get you in touch with these wonderful people as well. So thank you both, and thank you to everyone joining us here live. Next week we're going to talk about variety and hybrid selection as well, and yeah, I really appreciate it. So thank you, and we'll see everybody
Thank
next
you.
week.
Thanks for having me on.
All right, bye, Joanna. Cheers, everybody.